Hello everyone, and welcome to my Young and the Restless official 24 channel. I hope everyone is having a wonderful day. Before we begin, please hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. Claire Grace Newman had always known that her place in the sprawling Newman dynasty was precarious, but nothing could have prepared her for the searing sting of humiliation and heartbreak that descended upon her the very moment Victor Newman, the indomitable patriarch whose authority weighed like stone over every corner of the family, announced the results of the DNA test that had held the entire clan in suspense for weeks. The great living room of the Newman ranch was thick with anticipation. As Nikki's anxious fingers twisted around a glass of water she hadn't touched, Victoria stood stiff-backed and unblinking, her jaw locked in a mixture of hope and dread. Nick's skeptical eyes kept darting toward his father as though already bracing for fallout, and Adam, ever the opportunist, ever the cynic, leaned against the back of a chair with a sardonic grin playing at the corner of his mouth, quietly savoring the idea of yet another sibling scandal ready to fracture the already crumbling foundation of the family. But amid all that tension it was Claire who felt as though the walls were closing in, every breath more shallow, every glance directed at her heavy with unspoken judgment. When Victor cleared his throat, drawing the attention of the entire room like the tolling of a bell, and declared with his signature gravitas that the test proved beyond doubt that Claire was indeed his blood, Victoria's child, Nikki's granddaughter, yet somehow the tone in his voice carried not just authority but suspicion, as though the truth written in black and white on the crisp hospital document was not enough to erase the months of doubt, betrayal, and manipulation that had preceded this revelation. Claire's world tilted off its axis, because rather than embracing her as the lost daughter who had returned against all odds, the family seemed more consumed with the drama of it all, with how this bombshell would affect their reputations, their inheritances, their alliances, and Claire could see it in their eyes that while DNA proved biology, it did not prove belonging, it did not prove love, it did not prove that she would be accepted, and that was the knife that slid between her ribs, twisting cruelly with every heartbeat. The air was suffocating, the silence after Victor's announcement deafening, and though Nikki's eyes softened with grandmotherly instinct, though Victoria's lips parted as if she wanted to say something, anything, that might mend the years of distance between them, Claire couldn't bear the weight of their hesitation, their uncertainty, their fear that maybe she was too damaged by the past, too shaped by Jordan's manipulations, too fractured to ever truly be part of their carefully polished legacy. So before a word could be spoken, before an embrace could be offered or denied, Claire felt her legs move on their own, propelling her through the threshold of the great room, past the heavy double doors, into the crisp evening air where the wind bit her cheeks and the stars above blurred through tears she couldn't hold back, her only thought to run, to escape, to flee from the oppressive scrutiny of a family that claimed her by blood yet looked at her as though she were a stranger, a mistake, a living ghost resurrected from a nightmare. The gravel crunched beneath her hurried steps as her shoes slipped against the uneven driveway, her pulse thundering in her ears louder than the echoes of Victor's booming voice, and every memory of rejection, every whispered insult, every manipulative word Jordan had ever planted in her mind about never being wanted, never being good enough, roared back with cruel clarity, reminding her that DNA didn't change destiny, it didn't erase scars, it didn't guarantee a home. And as she stumbled toward the gate, fumbling for air, she heard behind her the muffled shouts of Victoria calling her name, the commanding bark of Victor demanding she stop, but the voices only drove her faster, like hounds chasing prey, because Claire knew that if she stopped now, if she allowed them to cage her with promises or pity, she would lose the last shred of control she had over her own story, and she could not, allow herself to be defined solely by a piece of paper, by a surname that carried weight in Genoa City but felt like chains around her soul. No, Claire was running not just from the ranch, not just from the family who had finally been forced to acknowledge her existence, but from the crushing expectation that she should be grateful, that she should be relieved, that she should immediately fold into their narrative of redemption and reconciliation when the truth was that her heart was still raw, still bleeding, still too haunted by the darkness Jordan had carved into her to embrace the light Victor claimed to offer. And as the Newman estate disappeared behind her, swallowed by the night, Claire's thoughts churned with questions. Where could she go? Who could she turn to? What did it even mean to be a Newman if the name felt like both salvation and curse? What did it mean to be a daughter to a mother who hadn't raised her, a granddaughter to a grandmother who had barely known she existed, a sister to cousins who eyed her with suspicion, a pawn in Victor's endless game of power, and though fear gnawed at her, the loneliness wrapped cold fingers around her spine, there was also a flicker of defiance in her chest, a stubborn flame that whispered maybe running was not weakness, maybe it was the only way to prove that she was more than just DNA, more than just a pawn, more than just a victim, and as tears streamed hot and relentless down her face, Claire vowed that she would not return until she knew who she truly was, until she could stand before them not as a frightened girl desperate for approval but as a woman who had carved her own place in the world, with or without the Newman name. Claire didn't look back as she tore down the long stretch of road leading away from the Newman ranch, but the image of Victoria standing frozen in the doorway, hand reaching out but failing to cross the distance between them, seared itself into her mind like a scar she couldn't shake, because part of her had wanted nothing more than for her mother to come after her, to fight for her, to prove that love meant more than bloodlines and more than Victor's decree, yet the silence behind her told Claire that hesitation still ruled, that the family was once again paralyzed by appearances and the unspoken question of whether she was trustworthy enough to embrace. The longer she ran, the heavier that realization weighed, every step fueled not only by heartbreak but by a sharp-edged anger that cut through the fog of tears. Anger at Victor for delivering the DNA results like a judge passing down a sentence instead of a father welcoming a child. Anger at Nikki for softening but never speaking. Anger at Nick and Adam for treating her like a ticking bomb rather than a sister. Anger at herself for still craving their acceptance after everything she had endured. By the time she reached the edge of town, her breath ragged and her pulse hammering, the neon lights of a late-night diner glowed in the distance, and Claire stumbled toward it like a shipwreck survivor toward a lighthouse, the thought of coffee, warmth, and anonymity the only tether keeping her from collapsing entirely, because in that moment she didn't want to be Claire Newman, or Claire Grace, or any version of herself that tied her to destiny. She just wanted to be invisible, nameless, someone who could disappear into the hum of chatter and clinking dishes, someone who didn't carry the weight of an empire on her fragile shoulders. Sliding into a corner booth, she pressed her palms to her temples, trying to steady the carousel of thoughts spinning wildly. What if Victor used the DNA results not to claim her but to control her? What if Adam used this revelation as ammunition in his endless battle against Victoria? What if Nikki never looked at her as anything more than a reminder of Jordan's cruelty? What if this so-called family would forever view her as a liability rather than a loved one? What if being a Newman meant shackling herself to secrets, betrayals, and manipulations that had already stolen so much of her innocence? As a waitress set down a cup of coffee with a tired smile, Claire's eyes stung again. And she quickly muttered thanks before lowering her gaze, terrified that even here, in this small, ordinary space, someone would recognize her as the girl from the Newman scandal, the one whose very existence had thrown Genoa City into a frenzy. But she didn't know that back at the ranch, chaos was unraveling in her absence, Victoria pacing frantically, blaming herself for not running after her daughter fast enough, Nikki insisting that Claire needed space but secretly wringing her hands with guilt, Nick muttering about security and how dangerous it was for her to be alone in the dark given the enemies their family had accumulated, Adam smirking while pretending to care, secretly thrilled that Victor's announcement had triggered such a spectacle, and Victor himself, stoic as ever, issuing orders to his staff to track Claire down as though she were a lost asset instead of a terrified young woman whose entire world had just been upended. Yet beneath Victor's steel exterior, there was a flicker of regret, a whisper of vulnerability he would never admit aloud, because even the great Victor Newman knew that bloodlines meant little if the person bearing his name chose to reject it, and Claire's flight stung in a way he hadn't expected, rattling him with the possibility that perhaps his commanding presence had driven her away rather than anchored her in place, but his pride, unyielding, immovable, would not allow him to soften, not yet, not when appearances demanded strength, and so he barked at Victoria to compose herself, snapping that they would handle the matter as they always did, with power, precision, and control. Meanwhile, Claire sat staring into the black swirl of her coffee, feeling the weight of her choices pressing in from every angle, knowing she couldn't hide forever but also knowing she couldn't return, not until she figured out what belonging meant to her, not until she decided whether she even wanted to be a Newman at all, because deep down she feared that if she walked back into that house tomorrow, Victor would clasp her shoulder like a general welcoming a soldier, not a father welcoming a daughter, and she would be swallowed whole by the machine that had chewed up so many others before her. In her heart, she craved love, family, and acceptance, but her instinct screamed for survival, and survival meant distance, survival meant carving her own path, survival meant proving to herself that she was more than the victim Jordan had molded, more than the lost child Victor had claimed, more than the fragile granddaughter Nikki had wept over. And as dawn threatened to break across the horizon, Claire wrapped her arms tightly around herself, whispering a vow that no matter how far she had to run, no matter how long it took, she would find a version of herself that wasn't defined by Victor's announcement, by a piece of paper stamped with DNA results, or by the shadow of a family legacy that seemed as suffocating as it was alluring. Back at the ranch, however, Victoria was already planning her next move, torn between respecting Claire's autonomy and fearing that if she didn't act fast, she might lose her daughter forever, and so the stage was set for a collision course that would rock Genoa City, Claire on a journey of self-discovery and rebellion, the Newmans rallying with equal parts love and control to bring her back, and a watching world of rivals, Phyllis, Sharon, even the ever-scheming Adam, ready to exploit the cracks in the family's foundation, leaving the question not of whether Claire would return, but of who she would be when she finally did, and whether the Newmans would embrace her, or be forced to reckon with a young woman who refused to let them define her fate. But as the morning light spilled across the cracked pavement outside the diner, Claire knew she couldn't sit there forever, couldn't hide in the corners of half-empty booths and hope that the tidal wave of the Newman name wouldn't crash down upon her, because Genoa City was a small town in all the ways that mattered, and whispers traveled faster than the wind. Soon enough, someone would recognize her. Soon enough, her presence would be reported, and soon enough, Victor would have his people tracking her every move, suffocating her all over again with the same intensity that had driven her out into the night in the first place. So she slid a few crumpled bills onto the table, murmured thanks to the waitress who had been kind without knowing the weight of her kindness, and stepped back into the cool morning air with nothing but a borrowed jacket and a storm of thoughts she couldn't silence, her feet carrying her down unfamiliar streets, away from the polished corners of Newman influence and into neighborhoods where she wasn't Claire Newman, the scandal, but just a girl passing by, and yet, even in her anonymity, the voices wouldn't stop, Jordan's cruel taunts echoing in her skull. You'll never belong, they'll never want you, you'll always be theirs by blood but never by love, intertwining with Victor's commanding voice announcing her DNA results like a verdict, and Victoria's silence, that devastating silence, the silence of a mother who wanted to embrace but hesitated, the silence that cut deeper than words ever could, because silence meant doubt, silence meant uncertainty, silence meant the kind of rejection Claire had spent her entire life running from, and so she kept moving, block after block, determined to stay ahead of the ghosts that trailed behind her. Back at the ranch, the Newman household was a cauldron of conflict, Victoria pacing and refusing to take Victor's orders at face value, her voice rising with raw emotion as she declared that Claire wasn't a situation or an issue to be managed, but her daughter, her flesh and blood, and she would not sit idly by while Victor treated Claire like an asset to be retrieved. Yet Victor stood unmoved, his booming insistence that the family needed to project strength clashing with Victoria's desperate plea for compassion, until Nikki finally raised her voice, rare and sharp, reminding both of them that Claire wasn't a pawn in their endless battles but a young woman drowning in confusion, and unless they changed their approach, they risked driving her away forever. Even Adam, who had been leaning smugly against the fireplace mantel, found himself uncharacteristically quiet in the wake of Nikki's words, because though his smirk never fully left his lips, some part of him recognized the fragility of the moment, the knife's edge the family was walking, and though he secretly delighted in the chaos, even Adam knew that losing Claire completely would create scars too deep to ever heal, scars that could splinter the Newmans beyond repair. And as arguments ricocheted through the great room, Claire had already slipped onto a bus headed out of town, her trembling hands clutching the worn fabric of her seat as she stared out the window, watching Genoa City blur into stretches of highway, her heart pounding with a mixture of relief and terror, because distance felt like safety but also like abandonment, and she wondered if her leaving would prove Jordan right after all, prove that she wasn't strong enough to face them, prove that she was destined to run forever. Yet the thought of returning, of walking back into that house and being consumed by their scrutiny and expectations, was unbearable, so she told herself that leaving wasn't running, it was surviving, It was buying herself time, it was reclaiming a sliver of control over a life that had been dictated by others from the moment she was born. But the farther the bus carried her, the sharper the ache in her chest grew, because even as she resisted, even as she tried to convince herself she didn't need them, there was a piece of her that longed for Victoria's arms, for Nikki's soothing words, even for Victor's iron presence if only it came with a trace of genuine love, and that longing warred with her pride until she pressed her forehead against the cool glass, whispering to herself that she would not return until she knew she was strong enough to face them on her own terms, because the one thing she refused to be ever again was powerless. Meanwhile, back in Genoa City, news of Claire's disappearance was already beginning to spread. Phyllis overhearing fragments at Crimson Lights and smirking at the opportunity for leverage, Sharon's concern surfacing as she quietly wondered if she should reach out to Claire herself, having once walked her own path of alienation and redemption, and even Summer, who had barely interacted with Claire, finding herself unsettled by the idea of a young woman caught between legacy and loneliness. And it was in these ripples that Claire's choice began to echo louder than Victor could contain. Because the truth was that every rival, every ally, every whisperer in town saw an opening in Claire's absence, a chance to poke holes in the mighty Newman armor, and as Victoria finally broke free of the ranch to begin her search, not as Victor's lieutenant but as a mother clawing through desperation, the stage was set for a battle that was no longer just about DNA results but about what it truly meant to be family, whether love could grow in the cracks left by decades of lies, and whether Claire would find the strength to return before the forces circling her family consumed her entirely. Yet as the bus rattled further down the highway, Claire's mind churned with questions she had no answers for, each one heavier than the last. Where would she sleep tonight? What would she eat tomorrow? How long could she really stay away before the magnetic pull of Genoa City and the Newman family drew her back against her will? And though she tried to steady her breathing, she could almost feel Victor's shadow looming across the miles, his will like an invisible hand determined to reel her in. And that thought alone made her grip the seat tighter, refusing to let herself crumble into the frightened girl Jordan had once conditioned her to be, because this time she wanted to prove that she was more than manipulation, more than bloodlines, more than the pawn in a family feud that stretched across decades. Meanwhile, back in Genoa City, Victoria was already on the phone with every contact she could think of, her voice cracking as she begged for sightings, for leads, for anything that might point her toward her daughter, her guilt spiraling into a storm as she confessed to Nikki that she should have run after Claire, should have pulled her into her arms no matter the uncertainty, no matter the questions, because hesitation had cost her more than she could bear, while Nikki, masking her own tears, tried to steady her daughter with quiet insistence that love wasn't measured in a single moment but in the fight to keep going, the fight to not give up. Yet both women knew deep down that Victor's cold, strategic approach threatened to drive the wedge deeper, his belief that control equaled safety clashing brutally with their aching need to show Claire unconditional love. Across town, Adam watched the spectacle unfold with a calculating gleam in his eyes, already considering how to spin the chaos to his advantage, how to remind Victoria that her maternal instincts had failed, how to needle Victor about his empire cracking under the weight of another family scandal. Yet even Adam, alone in his penthouse, felt a twinge of something unexpected, a faint recognition in Claire's struggle that mirrored his own years of rejection, the lonely ache of being acknowledged as Newman by name but rarely by heart, and though he shook the thought away, pouring himself a drink and smirking at his reflection, the truth lingered that Adam understood Claire more than he cared to admit, but for Claire, curled against the rattling bus window, none of that mattered now, not Victor's schemes, not Adam's smirk, not even Victoria's guilt, because she was on her own, and in that terrifying, exhilarating space between past and future, she clung to a single promise whispered into the hum of the engine: she would not return until she knew who she was without them, until she could decide for herself whether being a Newman was a gift, a curse, or something she could finally redefine on her own terms.